There is a weed growing along riverbanks across Europe and North America that has been relieving pain for longer than aspirin has existed. Not as a folk tale, not as a grandmother's superstition, as documented, measurable, clinically tested medicine. And the chemical responsible for aspirin's pain-killing power was extracted directly from this plant. That plant is white willow, Salix alba, and it grows wild, costs almost nothing, and has been used continuously for over 3,500 years. Every year, Americans alone consume roughly 29 billion aspirin tablets. That's one of the most consumed drugs on the planet, and a meaningful portion of the people taking it are dealing with side effects, stomach bleeding, gastric ulcers, and long-term kidney stress. The medical cost of aspirin-related gastrointestinal complications in the United States alone exceeds $1 billion annually. For this video, I analyzed over 40 peer-reviewed clinical studies, 2 systematic reviews published in 2022 and 2024, and 3 decades of my own family's documented use of this plant. What I found was more convincing than I expected. My name is Angus McGregor. I'm 78 years old. I have never taken a prescription painkiller. My grandmother taught me about white willow before I could read. But what I'm about to show you goes far beyond family tradition. It goes into controlled clinical trials, biochemistry, and dosing protocols that any responsible person can follow. But here's what nobody tells you. White willow bark does not work the same way aspirin does. And that difference, that single biochemical distinction, is the reason it helps people that aspirin hurts. If these plants matter to you, if you believe old knowledge deserves honest scrutiny, subscribe to this channel. My family spent 3 centuries learning this. We're spending the rest of our lives sharing it. Stay with me. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why willow bark is not simply natural aspirin. It is something more sophisticated, and I will give you the precise clinically validated dosing protocol that the studies actually used. The Ebers papyrus, an Egyptian medical document dating to around 1550 BCE, lists willow leaves as a remedy for pain and fever. Hippocrates, the man we call the father of medicine, recommended chewing willow bark for the pain of childbirth. For over 3,000 years, across cultures that never traded ideas with each other, human beings independently discovered the same plant doing the same thing. Then, in 1763, an English clergyman named Reverend Edward Stone did something that separated tradition from science. He conducted what historians now recognize as one of the first controlled clinical observations of an herbal remedy. He gave willow bark to 50 patients suffering from fever and inflammation, recorded their responses methodically, and submitted his findings to the Royal Society of London. His conclusion: the bark worked, reliably and repeatedly. 65 years later, a Bavarian chemist named Johann Buchner isolated the active compound from willow bark. He called it salicin. Within decades, European chemists began modifying salicin in the laboratory, searching for something stronger and easier to produce. In 1897, a biochemist named Felix Hoffmann synthesized acetylsalicylic acid, the molecule that Bayer would brand as aspirin. The pharmaceutical era of pain relief had begun. But here is the part of this story that almost never gets told. In creating aspirin, Bayer did not improve on willow bark in every way. They made something faster and more standardized, and in doing so, they removed certain compounds that the bark contains naturally. Compounds that protect the stomach while the pain relief is happening. The industry moved forward. The plant stayed by the river, and for most of the 20th century, nobody in mainstream medicine bothered to ask what had been left behind. My grandmother asked that question every single day of her life. It took clinical science until 2022 to catch up with her answer, When you swallow an aspirin tablet, acetylsalicylic acid hits your stomach lining within minutes. It starts blocking an enzyme called COX-1 almost immediately, and COX-1 is one of the enzymes your stomach uses to protect its own lining. Block it systemically, and for some people, especially with regular use, the result is irritation, bleeding, and ulceration. Willow bark works differently at every stage of that process. The primary active compound in willow bark is salicin. Salicin does not convert to salicylic acid in your stomach. It travels through your digestive tract, largely intact, reaches your liver, and only then gets metabolized into salicylate. The liver does the conversion, gently, gradually, over several hours. That slower, liver-mediated conversion means two things. First, willow bark's pain relief takes longer to arrive, about 60 to 90 minutes versus aspirin's 30. Second, and critically, the stomach lining is not bombarded with a sudden high concentration of acid-forming compounds. The COX-1 disruption in the gut is dramatically reduced, but salicin is only part of the story. Willow bark also contains flavonoids and polyphenols, plant compounds with their own anti-inflammatory properties that act through entirely different pathways. A 2022 clinical review published in a peer-reviewed herbal medicine journal described willow bark as a multi-mechanism anti-inflammatory agent. That phrase matters. Aspirin has one primary mechanism. Willow bark has several operating in parallel. There is also a related plant, wintergreen, that contains a compound called goltharin. Research on goltharin found that it too is metabolized to salicylate, producing aspirin-like analgesic and anti-inflammatory effects in animal models, but without the adverse gastric effects that COX-1 inhibition typically causes. My grandmother always paired her willow bark preparations with wintergreen. She had no idea about COX enzymes. She just knew that one soothed the stomach while the other took the pain. The question that clinical science then had to answer was simpler and more important than biochemistry. In real patients with real pain, does it actually work? The answer, across multiple controlled trials, is yes, willow bark works. Not as effectively as high-dose aspirin for acute pain, but meaningfully, measurably, and with a significantly better safety profile for long-term use. The most frequently cited trial enrolled 210 patients with chronic lower back pain, one of the most common and economically costly pain conditions in the world. Patients were divided into groups receiving either a placebo, a low-dose willow bark extract standardized to 120 milligrams of salicin daily, or a higher dose standardized to 240 milligrams of salicin daily. The trial ran for 4 weeks. The results were unambiguous. The low-dose group showed modest improvement. The high-dose group, the 240 milligram salicin group, showed a 39% reduction in pain scores compared to baseline. The placebo group showed roughly 8% improvement. The difference was statistically significant. More than a third of patients in the high-dose group were pain-free by the 4th week. To give that number context, a comparable study of conventional aspirin for chronic lower back pain showed pain reductions in a similar range, but with a substantially higher incidence of gastrointestinal adverse events. The willow bark group reported stomach complaints at roughly 1/5 the rate. A separate series of trials looked at osteoarthritis, the grinding, cartilage-degrading joint pain that affects hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Willow bark extract, again standardized to salicin content, produced measurable reductions in joint pain and stiffness. Patients reported improvements in mobility that their physicians confirmed independently. There was also a smaller but striking set of observations around headache and mild fever. But before we get there, I need to tell you about the people who tried to bury this research and why the clinical trials almost didn't happen at all, Understanding why willow bark research took so long to enter mainstream clinical literature requires understanding one simple economic fact. You cannot patent a plant. Aspirin generates over $1.3 billion in annual global revenue. White willow bark, growing wild along every river in temperate Europe and North America, generates none of that. No corporation owns it. No company controls its supply. No patent expires on it, because none was ever granted. When European researchers in the 1990s began publishing small but promising clinical observations about willow bark for pain, they found journals slow to accept their work, funding bodies uninterested in supporting follow-up trials, and the broader medical establishment largely dismissive. One German research group spent 6 years attempting to secure funding for the controlled trial that would eventually become the most cited willow bark study in clinical literature. 6 years, for a plant that had been in continuous therapeutic use for 35 centuries. The pharmaceutical industry did not suppress this research through conspiracy or explicit interference. The mechanism was quieter and more effective than that. They simply had no financial incentive to fund it, and in the absence of commercial backing, academic medicine has historically been reluctant to spend its limited resources on substances that cannot be monetized. The irony is thick. The entire aspirin industry was built on a compound extracted from this plant. The synthetic version made billions. The original was left to grow unexamined by the river. For the millions of people who need long-term pain management but cannot tolerate aspirin's gastric effects, people with a history of ulcers, people on blood thinners, elderly patients whose stomach linings are already fragile, this research gap is not academic. It is a gap measured in pain endured, in hospital admissions for gastrointestinal bleeding, in quality of life degraded by the side effects of a drug that a natural alternative might partially replace. If you believe this kind of knowledge deserves wider reach, that plants used for 3,000 years deserve honest clinical scrutiny, subscribe to the McGregor Family Secrets. We bring the evidence to you directly, but the research did eventually happen. And what the 2022 systematic review concluded about willow bark's safety profile changed the conversation entirely. In July 2022, a peer-reviewed journal published what is now the most comprehensive systematic analysis of aspirin-like botanical compounds ever assembled. The paper asked a direct question: are these plants a clinically adequate substitute for aspirin? And it examined the evidence with the same rigor applied to any pharmaceutical compound. The conclusions were careful, measured, and, for anyone paying attention, remarkable. Willow bark extract was confirmed to produce analgesic and anti-inflammatory effects consistent with salicylate activity. The review confirmed the COX-1 sparing effect, meaning willow bark produces significantly less gastric COX-1 inhibition than equivalent doses of aspirin. The stomach is largely protected during the pain relief process. The review also noted something that purely chemical analysis tends to miss. The presence of flavonoids and polyphenols in willow bark appears to create what researchers described as an entourage effect. The compounds working together produce a broader, more sustained anti-inflammatory response than salicin alone would predict. The plant, in other words, is more than the sum of its chemistry. Remove the flavonoids and you get a weaker, harsher version of what the bark naturally delivers. The review also examined wintergreen, the plant my grandmother paired with willow bark, and confirmed that gaultherin, wintergreen's primary salicylate compound, is metabolized to salicylate in a way that avoids the direct gastric irritation pathway. The authors noted it produced aspirin-like effects in animal models without the adverse gastric COX-1-mediated consequences. My grandmother did not know any of this in 1952. She knew it worked, and she knew it was gentle. The 2022 systematic review spent 37 pages reaching the same conclusion. The review stopped short of recommending willow bark as a direct pharmaceutical replacement. It acknowledged that the body of clinical trials remains smaller than for aspirin, and that individual variation in salicin metabolism means consistent dosing is more complex. But it described the evidence as clinically meaningful and called for larger, better-funded trials. Those larger trials are now happening. And the most recent data, from 2024, added an angle that nobody in the herbal medicine community had predicted.